This is the third session on the clean architecture, .NET Core 5 Web APIs for the microservices. In this course, we are going to discuss the API configuration, especially on the dependency injection, API versioning along with the Swagger, course configuration, and logging, exception handling, some of the configurations on the main.cs, program.cs or startup.cs of the .NET Core Web APIs. So prior to this, I have made two more videos on the actual clean architecture fundamentals. In that fundamentals, that was a complete theory where we understood and I tried to explain what the clean architecture should look like, what are the different patterns and the principles we should be following, and how to create the folder project structure in the clean architecture for the web APIs. In the second video, I have actually implemented the project structure. So that was the complete practical and created the solution structure with the core API and the infrastructure projects, created the files, folders, and also added one of the API endpoint on that particular video. So let me take to the agenda for the, as I mentioned in the previous video, these are the different topics we discussed. We talked about what are the prerequisites if you are starting the greenfield application, if you are new to the programming, or what are the different softwares required. We discussed. We created the Azure DevOps project, Git repo, pull, push, and then creating the added some of the git ignore, git attribute files to the solution, and then also added all the repo service controllers. Some of the dependency injection related configurations are added in the project. So this is how we ended up in the second video. So we have skeleton prepared so that we can start working on adding more and more to the existing skeleton. This is the actual project we created in the chapter or the video 1. In the second, now in today's video, I am going to discuss the API configuration, where how to configure the Automapper and what are the different settings required in the program and startup class, and then adding some of the files like API constants to managing the constants, app settings for managing the app setting configurations, and also configure the logging except for the exception handling and log using the nlog. Then adding some of the extensions, these are some of the best practices in the .NET Core 5 web APIs, like configuring core, configure fluent validations for validating the request objects. We will also discuss the dependency injection, Swagger configuration, and we also discuss about service, where to maintain the service description, readable contents. So we will also talk about the some of the routing related information, fixing some of the URL to make it lowercase, and then exception handling, HSTS, also API versioning, course, Azure Key Vault. Maybe Azure Key Vault and health check I might not be able to cover in this video. I will take that for the chapter 4. Let me start looking at the solution where we left last time and then continue from there. This is my service. I call it as a feedback service. So I just selected easy to build quickly. So I am working on the feedback service. And let me quickly run the application to make sure that if the API is working as expected. So this is the API looks like. So the weather forecast API endpoint came along with the default template initially. This is how the API endpoint we added last time. Now we are getting this error saying that unable to resolve the server. So this is related to the dependency injection. It's good that we need to get these kind of errors while working on. If you are not getting any errors, that means that's not a good sign. So you will not be able to learn it. So we have to, whenever you get these kind of errors, if you are unable to understand, you just Google it, and then you will be able to get some Stack Overflow. You pick up something Stack Overflow and try to see what the error is. So since I'm working since long time, I'll be able to easily guess what these errors are. But in case if you are not familiar, just copy paste this error on the Google and pick the Stack Overflow link. So that's the easy way to fix the issue. So let's start adding the Automapper, and then start adding the dependency injection to resolve these kind of issues. So let's close this, and then let's take a look at the Automapper. So in order to fix the Automapper, this is a really good article on the Automapper implementation in the .NET Core APIs. What is required for the Automapper implementation? There are three primary things. One, installing the dependency, all the dependency NuGet packages. So this is the dependency NuGet package install Automapper extension Microsoft dependency injection. So this will also install the dependency NuGet packages along with that. If you are using the .NET Core, this is the right NuGet package. If you are not using the .NET Core, it's not the extension one. You just need the Automapper itself. That's the step number one. Step number two, we need to add this line of code in the startup.cs configure services method. And step number three, you might already have two classes want to map from one class to other class. In this case, user class is mapping into the user view model, for example. And then you also need to create a profile new class, and then that has to inherit from the profile Automapper class, so that you can actually create the map from source to destination. So these are the three steps required before using the Automapper. The fourth one is actually consuming the Automapper in your repository or the service or the controller, wherever you want to do the mapper. So you will say, you will have to create the constructor and then say mapper.map, and then pass the target object where you want to map into. So this is the target object, this is the source object. This is how the Automapper will be consumed. Inside internally, the Automapper is actually using the reflection to map from one object to the other object. So we don't need to dig details of how that really works. In case if you have different property names inside the class, for example, my destination has the F name, by my source has the first name. So you, in the profile file, you have to explicitly use or do the mapping like this. And if you want to do the reverse mapping, you don't need to write again the second line. Rather, you can say dot reverse map. So that means it will map from view model into users. So that's how the mapper works. So let's begin implementing the mapper in the feedback service. So as I mentioned, the first step, I need to figure out adding the dependency, all the dependencies required. So I'm going to use the mapper in my infrastructure project. So I already have the dependency in the NuGet package installed before in the previous video. So this is the dependency NuGet package. I already have that. And then the next one, I'm going to add the startup class. So let me add this in the startup class. So I think I need the extension method. Oops, I added in the wrong place. So let me keep that in the right place. Services dot add Automapper and type of a startup class. And then step 3, I'm going to create a helper folder inside the API so that I can keep the mapper profile. So I have to create a new class. Mapper profile.cs, and then I need to inherit this from the dot profile, which is going to be part of the Automapper. Using statement is required. What I need is inside the constructor, I need to map the property. So I'm going to use this mapper. So let me see if I have the feedback inside the core model. So let's look at the core project. Inside the core, I have the feedback. So this is the using statement required here. Let's see. So it's a model, not model. So now let me see subject, message, and rating. And in the, I think I don't need the user ID. So let me quickly delete this. So I'm going to also keep the created by and also created date. So now I have the source and target. My source is the entities feedback. My target is core models feedback. So I have to map from source to destination. So that's going to happen in the repository method. In the repository, I have get all feedbacks. And here is how I'm going to use the Automapper. So I have the IMapper already added in the constructor, and then IMapper.map, and then it's mapping the collection of feedbacks. This is the feedback. So this is the DB feedback mapping into DTO, which is also model feedback objects. So if I put a breakpoint here, and I will be able to get the data. So before that, let me quickly add some data in the DB context so that when I call the get feedbacks, I should be able to get the list of feedbacks. So what I'll do is I create a seed method here and then add some data. I already have that method created. So this is how the method will look like, and it will add all these entries. So I'm going to call this method on the constructor so that when the application running, the data will be added in the feedbacks so that I can call the get feedbacks API. When the get feedbacks API gets called, I'm going to get the data. So this is going to be triggered from the services, and then the service method is called from the controller. So this is the sequence. I also created one diagram to explain how the sequence is going to be when the user enter the API endpoint on the browser or the postman. So let's say this is the API endpoint. Now this API endpoint will be passing the request object. By, for example, when we are creating the create feedback endpoint, we will know this request object details, and then the controller will take that request, process that request in terms of authorizing that request or validating that request, and then pass that request to the service. The service will map from the DTO object into the entity. Entity is the data model, DB context entity, and then from service you can make API. From service you can make external API calls, or also you can make the repository calls. In case of external API calls, you may want to generate the stub or the service proxy for the external and keep that in this folder. So I'm going to give one of the example how to use the nswag to generate the stub. So we'll be focusing on the repository method. So I have added a repository already. That repository will call the DB context, fire the query from the database, fetch the data, and then map that DB context, DB object back into the DTO model. And then if there is any business logic, any filtering need to be happen, that will be happening on the service layer. And then it goes to the controller layer, where in case exception handling exception happens, the controller handles those exceptions. So we are going to centralize those exceptions at the controller level, or having the middleware. I'm going to discuss that part also subsequently, and then return the actual response if everything goes successful. So this is the sequence we will be using while coding any API endpoint. As I mentioned, step 1, step 2, step 3. So here you will have service calls or the database calls, or also you can have both sometimes, right? That is all going to be handled in the feedback service. Then the database context, and then reverse direction all the way, returning back the response back to the browser. This is how we will be having here. If I have to debug here, let me put a breakpoint here to show exact flow what I discussed in the PPT here. If I put the breakpoint and then try to run the get feedbacks API endpoint. Now in this case, I'm still getting the error, so I have to resolve the dependency injection for the service and the repositories which I'm using here. So let me quickly add those dependency injection related stuff. So I will add those 2 lines here. I'm going to add the using statement. These are my dependencies right now. Feedback service. Let me go here. So this is my using statement. So looks like it shows that with the same name, I also have the namespace, so that's why I'm not able to resolve that dependency. So I have to rename this instead of calling the feedback service because this is conflicting with the namespace. So I have to give a different name to this service. So let me call this as the feedback service. For now, I will call the feedback service. I'll fix that later so that I can proceed for the this one. So I will name this also. That's the feedback service. Added the dependency injection here. So there are two dependency injections here, the service one and the repository added here. So let's make sure that the API is working as expected. Some services are not able to construct while I think there are some dependencies with the same name. Let me see. So I need to add feedback DB context. Okay. Feedback service unable to resolve the type of feedback DB context while attempting to activate. So I think I have to look at if there are any dependencies required. Okay, so looks like I need to add the entity framework database connection string. That's how it looks like by looking at the error. So let me go and enable the DB context here in the start config service, add DB context with the feedback DB context. I'm going to use initially for the in-memory. This is how we will be using the in-memory one. For this, we need reference from I just added a new package for in-memory, which is Microsoft Entity Framework Core in-memory, so that you will be able to in-memory database context. So let me quickly run if this works. Yeah, that is working. So that's the issue. I'm getting feedback. So as I mentioned earlier, so this is the flow. I'm going to see while debugging, controller will call the service will call the repository and the DB context, and then mapping the data back into the DTO. If there is no business logic for the endpoint I'm working on, I will show you when there is a business logic, and then let's continue looking into here. So I'll press F11. My controller is in the service. Now F11. My controller is in the repos. Now I go and get the data. So I have all the feedbacks. There are 4 feedbacks I seeded initially. So this is the feedback data. And then let's do the mapping. So I mapped into the target object, which is the DTO model. So I should be able to get all those 4 models here. Yeah. So that's the response I will be getting as part of the Swagger endpoint. So that's how we will be configuring the Automapper and mapping the data and also seeding the information initially. So I'm going to create the database table and get this same data from the database table. For now, I'm going to continue with this static data. Then in the next video, I will continue with the data .NET Core Entity Framework Core. Before I proceed further, let me commit these changes so that I don't lose these changes. So added Automapper. So I would also like to clean up since the get feedbacks API endpoint is working, I don't need the weather forecast controller, which is added as part of the default template. So I will also delete that completely. so that I don't need those things. Make sure that the Swagger endpoint is still working, able to see the get feedbacks. Yep, this is still working as expected. Now next I will start looking at the configuration on the startup.cs file. So in the startup.cs file, there are two methods you will see. One is the configure service and the second one is the configure. So the configure service, these are the two default methods came along with .NET Core API template. For configure service will be used to configure all the services like configuring the controllers, Swagger, DB context. So we are actually adding all of them to the service. And then the second one, configure, basically called for during the HTTP request pipeline to add all the middleware components. Like if it is a development mode, then add the developer exception page. So like we saw the developer exception page on the Swagger, I'm going to discuss that also. And configuring the Swagger HTTP redirect. So these are all the middleware components part of the startup.cs getting added by default. Now I'm going to, if you are looking for more information related to the actual fundamentals of the ASP.NET Core, so there is a good article here talking about services required by the APIs are configured in the first method, and the second one, apps required handling pipeline is defined, and a series of middleware components are going injected as part of this configuration. And we will also be having the default .NET Core provided dependency injection, and then we can also have custom middleware or the ASP.NET Core middleware configured in the startup.cs, and whole bunch of the logging, configuring, all those things we are going to discuss right now. So this is a good article to understand the configuration of the program.cs, also the startup.cs. Now I will focus more on these two files by adding settings. So initially I created the app settings. I think we can keep this outside. This is going to be used for managing all the app settings from the app settings file. So let me introduce a couple of app settings so that I will know how to use and explain how to use those too. So for example, I want to add app settings for keyword name and the bypass keyword. So the purpose of the keyword name is that's a keyword server service name in case if you are having any secrets in the .NET Core API like your connection strings or any passwords, those are going to be in the Azure keyword. So that will be the next session. I'll be talking about how to configure the keywords. And when you're working on locally, probably you may want to bypass the keywords because otherwise you need to get, every developer has to get the keyword service access. So if you want to quickly test locally, you may want to bypass that. So these are the app settings I'm going to use. And for that purpose, I need the appsetting.cs file. So I created the appsetting.cs file here. Let me add those two properties. One is for the keyword name and the second one is for the bypass keyword. Same thing, I also need the API constant. Let me create one more class for the API constants. So I'm going to keep the constants like the service name or the service friendly name. So for example, I'm going to say feedback service, feedback This is my friendly name and this is the actual service name which I'm going to use. So all the constants specific to this API will be kept inside the constants file. Let me also pull this out of the folder so I don't need separate folder. Let me also, now this is clear. Let me quickly correct the namespace. So that settings and file, corrected the namespace. So those two will be used. I will explain when I will be using those two. Now I'm going to introduce one more file called service extensions. The reason I want to have the service extension is to avoid all the configurations, the extensions I'm adding in the registering in the startup.cs. So that will grow and the file size will be increased. So to avoid that, we can use this service extension. For example, if I'm having the cars configuration, so I don't have the cars configuration here, but Swagger configuration, cars configuration, dependency injection. So those are all will be in a separate file so that the startup.cs will be clean and neat, and we will not be adding everything in the startup.cs. So rather we should be having separate files. So for example, configure cars is going to be part of the service extension. So this is my method name. So this will be static method, and this required a namespace, dependency injection namespace. Now, if I want to call this, I'm going to call this code in the startup.cs file. So in the startup.cs, I will call this configure cars method, which is part of the service extension. So I'm going to add more method inside the service extensions, just like I have done in the cars. So let me go and add the dependency injection also now in part of the startup CS, but I have created a separate file, dependency injection, so I will be moving into separate file now. Okay, let me make this dependency injection class as static. So all these extension methods are going to be static, and I will be, let me copy one of the dependency injection method. So here I'm going to have using statements. Let me also add the using statement for the configuration, which is Microsoft extension configuration, not the NuGet package. As usual, always check, make sure that the object is not null. Otherwise, throw the null argument null exception. So done on both the methods so that you can write the unit test cases. And then we also need the namespaces for the service, also for the repository. So the interfaces are coming from the core, and this is going to be the feedback service. Under the feedback service core services, and repositories under the interface, the actual implementation in the infrastructure project. So this is how I can call it as a configure dependency injection in the static class, and the static, this is the extension method. And then I'm going to call this method in the startup class, just like I did in the configure course. Open the startup there. So I'm going to call the configure dependency injection here, and then I can remove these. So let me move them here. These two are already there. I need just this one. Again, some using statements, and this is part of the Microsoft entity core. Now I don't need these here since I moved into extension method. So this is for the course. Course has own file, service extension, and dependency injection. Since this is since you keep adding more and more API endpoints and the controllers and services, so this will also increase. So it's always better to have a separate file for the dependency injection, separate file for the service extension. So this will also be used for more extensions. And what else I have? So let me also look at the improvements in the program.cs file. So this is a basic template given program.cs file, but I'm going to add few more things in this. One for loading the app setting file is need this piece of code, reading the ASP.NET Core environment. So this is the current, whichever is the current environment, and using statement. Then this is the configure builder. Then default, I will be adding the JSON file, add JSON file to the config builder. So that basically loading all the configurations, app settings into the config file. Development environment, then current environment is development, then also load the development environment app setting file into the configuration. And I also need, let me keep this in the try catch statements, then call this inside the try. Then I'm also going to add a couple of logging some of the things. Since I haven't configured the logging yet, so I'm going to comment for now. As part of the logging, I will come back here and enable this. I'm going to keep throw the exception here if there is any exception, so that I know the service is running. When the service is started, the exception, the information is going to be logged under the logger. So we'll be using the nlog. I'll be talking about the nlog. The configuration is going to be stored there. So I also need the finally statement just for shut down the log manager. So I will be using those. I uncomment those after some time. But let me finish the rest of the things. So here it is actually returning the host builder, create host builder. So I ran into the issues when I'm using the create host builder. I had to convert this into create web host builder to support the test integration test cases. So I found this is a really helpful Stack Overflow link for understanding the difference between iHost, web host builder and web host. And here code where in case if you are planning to use the integration testing, so you might be required the test host. For that we need the create web host builder. So that's the reason I had to change that to the create web host builder to support. I changed that to web host builder, correct that code. So this is all I need for now in the program.cs file. I will be coming back when I'm actually doing the nlog configuration and enable and comment these things. So we corrected the startup.cs, adding the dependency injection, moving some of the configurations into the extension methods, so that these are some of the best practices we should be following. And I will also talk about the NSwag now in a minute. Okay, so before proceed further, let me quickly make sure that the web API endpoint is still working with these changes without any issues, so that we are not proceeding further with issues. So let me commit these changes so that we will not be losing those changes. Added CI corrected startup dot cs and dot cf files. So just quickly, so I removed this file, added the new file, app settings, added app setting file related to these key vault. So normally key vault, bypass key vault will be true in the local environment, but in the server, the bypass key vault should be false. Also added the dependency injection, moved all the dependency injection related information into the dependency injection class, and also corrected program.cs to load the app settings, app setting dot development dot json, app setting dot json file, and also added the service extension, added the dependency injection related configuration. So let me commit these changes. In the next step, I'm going to create use the Swagger configuration.cs file, which is already created earlier. Again, this should be static method, and then let me move create methods and move the Swagger configuration information into that particular file, because I'm going to add more information in the Swagger, so that will get increased. The file size will start up if I keep adding in the startup.cs, so that will not be clean. So I have to move the add Swagger gen and also use Swagger. So these are the two methods I need to create in the Swagger configuration for keeping that code. One for configure Swagger for adding it to the adding the services, Swagger services. This is the code, so we need to make sure that add these using statements, and we need to call that in the startup wherever we are calling the Swagger. So remove the default one from here and replace the configure Swagger. The same thing, we need another method for apps. Going to add one more method here for configure the Swagger, which is this is something we are calling from here. So we don't need these now. So this is how, okay, I need to call that new method from here. So I think instead of, I need even in the server, so I can keep outside, not necessarily in the environment itself. So I kept that outside. Now make sure that the Swagger is still working after moving the code into separate file. Working fine. So that's how the Swagger configuration. So now I'm going to expand the Swagger configuration related changes. For that, let me commit. Move the Swagger related code in. Now I'm going to add the service description. So when I run the application, I would like to see some description related to the service. For example, about the feedback service, I want to add some description here, list of database tables used, or any kind of information, or what the source code location for this service. So those are the kind of information it's really good to have on the Swagger itself, so that if the new developers are started working on, so they will know what this service is all about, where the source code is located, how to generate the JSON file, and those kind of information, and what are the backend database used, and what are the tables used. So in order to keep that information, I have added a file called service description. So that's the markdown.md file. So I'm going to add some description here and read that through the configuration file, so that is going to be visible on the Swagger web page. So for that, we need to add the description first. So I already typed some description here. So this feedback service will be used in ABC application to manage the feedback information and blah, blah, blah. So some other text I added just to make it as a description. So I called it as a service description. So you need to know a little bit about the MD syntax so that you will be able to understand. So I have also added the source code location, and the database used is the feedback, and with some of the tables, for example. So that's how we will be seeing on the UI side. So let me open the Swagger configuration and add few lines to make that description available on the UI side. In the configuration, I need to read the file. So that is system.io. And then I also need some of the information related to XML. So this is what I feedback service, and then V1 version description, and then this is the with the same file name, with the same project. So there will be XML file created to keep all the documentation. So this will include XML comments. If I add any XML comments, so that's going to be displayed on the Swagger configuration. Also need one more code here. I think this is something I might be using later. So let's see what else is required. So I also need to add service description class, for example, for that and also I have to include this. So instead of reading from the root path, I read it from here. And when I run, I should be able to see that description, right? Everything is fine. I purposely want to see this error. So it says that they could not find the file here. That's because of the .md file is not copied. So you just make. Now I can see the description, whatever is added in the .md file. So you can expand this, you can add more and more information, and that is what is going to be displayed here, but not add 2 pages of the documentation. So that's not good. So please add only whatever is required. So this is the connecting to the source code location. So this is JSON specs, and this is service description, what database used, what tables used. So this is the Swagger description is all about. Let me commit this code before proceed further. Added service description in the Swagger. Why? I also noticed the URL pattern. For example, get feedback should say API slash. So this should be small case. I would like to keep all the URLs in lowercase. And instead of saying get feedback, that's not the REST naming URL convention. So it should be just the feedback. So let me correct that. So in that case, I need to call all the controllers in plural. So I should be calling feedback so that I should be getting the feedback. So, and also I need to make the F small. So let me go and make that change. So I would rename this of the service, rename this to feedback. So it will also ask to replace everywhere. Now I see the feedbacks, and also noticed it is actually insisting to have the missing XML comments warning. So I just like to fix that by adding the, but I think let me first. So here I don't think I need this method. So it's going to be get the feedbacks. Also, I would like to make the URLs lowercase. So for that, in the startup.cs file, I need to correct add routing and lowercase URL is equal to true. With that, I should be able to see with the proper naming convention, the endpoint URL should be lowercase, and it also have just the feedback. So API slash feedbacks, and I'm getting all the feedback. So that's all I wanted to see. URL corrected. And now let me focus on the exception. So if there is an exception, when I click on this, if there is an exception, I need to understand how that exception will look like. So let me add explicitly throw the exception when I'm calling this method. I'm going to say throw new exception error while trying to call the get feedbacks method. So let me run and see how the exception looks like in the API. So I see the nice exception error while trying to get the feedback. So this is really user-friendly information along with all the headers, so that we'll be able to understand. That's happening because of the in the startup.cs file in the config we have, if it is a development environment, use the developer exception page. So this is the developer exception page. This is basically built for the ASP.NET MVC purpose, but it also works for the .NET Core. So just wanted to make sure that we understand this. Now, writing on the Swagger is fine. We also need to make sure that if you are deploying the service in the on-premise, you also want to log it somewhere in a file so that it is going to be useful for debugging the service if there are any issues on the environment side. So let me start adding the logger in the service. So in order to add the logger, I'm going to use the nlog, and we need a couple of references, the dependency injection, NuGet packages in the API project. So let me go and add those APIs, the NuGet packages. The first one I need is the nlog. So I'm going to install the nlog, and I also need the nlog extension logging. That's the second library I need. And I also need the nlog.web.ASP.NET Core. Nlog.web.ASP.NET Core. I need the Microsoft extension logging. So these are the 4 libraries I need. Let me make, I have added all the 4 libraries. And step 2, I need to correct few things in the program.cs. As I mentioned earlier, I will be coming back on the program.cs. So let me go and uncomment logging related stuff and add the log manager here. So these are the log managers. So for that I need the nlog. Also I need the nlog extension logging. So what I have done is just this is the high configuration root. So just so that I can load the configuration, nlog configuration related stuff in the configure log manager. So log manager dot configuration, and this will basically read all the configuration sections from the app setting dot JSON file and load it into the configuration, and then create current log manager so that I can use that log manager. When the service starts, I will say if the service is started. If the service is stopped, it will say service stopped. If there is an exception during the service launch, then it will also log the exception. Now, this is the program.cs changes. Let me also add few more things in the bottom here. Log.web. So what I have done is I've added the configure logging, and then log provider, the minimum is the trace, and also use the logging. And then finally I need to add the actual app setting configuration. So I already have in my other service. So these settings are required in the app setting .json file. Just paste it here. So this is a standard format for logging the exceptions in the API itself. So in the C logs with the service name, I would like to log all the exceptions. So these are some of the exceptions I would like to add. Let me see if I can. So initially my log folder is empty. Let me also, I'm getting some error. Could not parse the JSON file. Looks like there is some issue here. So I might need one line. Yeah, I was missing a curly brace here. Let me also forward and save it. And then let me just see, C logs is empty right now. So if I run when I'm running my project, I should be able to I'll be able to see my service file has the log information, and it will say feedback service start running. Press Control C to shut down, and also host environment is development, and then the actual root path is there. So this is what logged as part of the program.cs. Now let me run the API and how the exception is going to be logged here. So this is how what we see here. And if I go to the API, I see there is a file created with the error, with the exception handling. This is the unhandled exception, and this is the actual error message with where the error happened, including the line number and the controller. So if I have to introduce let me see if I can add one more level of logging, not only on the controller. I would also like to log the exception sometimes in the service level when I'm making the call to external, or for any reason if I want to make or log an exception, I should be able to log an error. I should be able to do that in the service level also. So in order to do the logging at the service level, first I need to add the logger here, just like I've done the repository. So let me add the logger. Then I need to correct the constructor. So here I need the package, NuGet package, Microsoft extension, logging and abstraction. So let me install that required package in the .NET in the core project, and then add the find and install feedback service, feedback service, and then just like the other constructor method, add the now if I want to let's say get feedbacks, I will just for fun I will add the try catch statement here, then keep my code inside the try catch exceptions. So let me throw some exception here and then try to log. So I will be throwing the argument null exception, and I will also want to log some custom exceptions. So purposely I am throwing the exception to see how the logging information shows at the service level. So use the try catch statement when there is an exception. I'm trying to log that exception error while trying to call the get feedbacks in the service class, and also log the exception itself. So let me remove at the controller level so that it will hit the service level exception and see how this exception will look like. So let me close that exception and clear the log, then run the application to see how the service level exception will look like. I'm calling the service, and I should be able to see null argument, null exception, and in the log I can see the exception like this. So error while trying to call the get feedbacks in the service class. This is the argument null exception under line number 36. Also the stack trace will show column controller, line number 40 and line number 36. The controller line number, whenever we are, so the line number 40 is calling the line number, causing the error in the line number 36. So that's how we'll be able to see the exceptions when the exceptions are logged in the by using the nlog. Just to recap on this topic before closing, before commit these changes and start the next step. So let's take a look at what we have done. Just rename the service to have the URLs for as per the REST format, and then added the nlog configuration here, and then added the required NuGet packages for the logging. One is the Microsoft extension logging, nlog, nlog extension logging, and also nlog web.sbnet core. I added some more information for loading the nlog in the configuration and logging some information during the startup. And in the startup.cs, we added this add route to correct the URL to make it lowercase. And then for testing, we added some logging in the feedback, get feedback, so that we can see how the exceptions looks like at the service level, and also how the exceptions looks like at the controller level. So we tested those things by throwing the exceptions explicitly. And here we need the logging abstraction NuGet package manager for the iLogger. So that's about the nlog. Let's move into the next one. So before that, I would like to commit these changes. Added log configuration. Commit the changes, and then let's look at how we can add the information in the server itself. So in the startup.cs, we have mentioned that if it is a development environment, use developer exception page. What if we run the same application in the production or in the actual environment? So what will be the else case? So I'm going to introduce the new middleware component for this API to capture the exception, and I'm going to customize the exception so that I can log the actual payload coming from the request object. So all that is going to be useful when you are actually debugging the application in the production. So if you don't know what the input and output parameters, and it is hard to replicate the issue. So for that, you need a new custom middleware, and call that custom middleware here to add exceptions for the environment. Locally, you are able to see and you know what the data is coming, all that is fine. But actually in the environment, you need to understand by logging what are the request headers information, what is the actual request object look like, and the value. Not logging the sensitive information, but at least you can customize what to log and what not to log. So let me introduce the middleware. So I'm going to add a new class called HTTP code and the log middleware. So let me see if I already added any middleware here. So no, I haven't added any middleware here. So I'm going to create a new folder called middleware and then add those classes. So let me stop the project. So this is the middleware folder. So I'm going to add all my custom middleware here. Add a new class. So I will name it as HTTP code and log middleware. Then I'm going to copy paste all the code as it is, because there is a lot of using statements. I'll go through the code in a minute. And then I also need one more method, one more class. So let me comment for now. So I need to add these classes. So I'm going to add these, create one more folder in the core. So it can be added in the API or the core. So, but I will add these in the core because these are going to be kind of a domain specific or the API specific. So let me add these classes here in the folder. I'll just copy paste all these methods from the different service. So I will rename the namespace. So let me explain whatever I have done. I think I need the using statement here to fix this. So there is a class called HTTP code and log middleware. So this is going to address the custom exceptions on the environment. So for that, I have the invoke method, and then the constructor. I have added these two for logging, and so I have a case statement where if API exception happens, it's treated as a bad request, and then write the bad request exception. So this is the private method where you can expand this and add as much information you want, and customizing your logging exception for your API. For example, I'm also writing the request method. So be careful while using this method, so not to add any sensitive information. As I mentioned, for example, if you are using this for the login controller, so that will be too risky. So make sure that you understand what is logging in the logger. So this method basically takes care of logging all the custom exceptions, including the authorization and the request body, etc. Depending on the exception types, if it is not found, you may want to have the different status code. If it is validation exception, you may want to have a different status code, same as the authentication related. So that otherwise it is going to be default unhandled exception. So this is what we are going to call this method in the startup for calling startup class. We open the else case. So I'm going to call this method. This middleware is going to be injected as part of this configure class, so that in the environment we are going to see this information. So for testing, since I'm testing locally, so I have to comment this and add this line of code for testing. So let me delete the existing log, then make sure that I still have the exception logging here to see the exception, how the exception is going to log in the log file in the environment itself. So I'll make a call now. So I see the custom exception on the log folder. I should be able to see all the information. For example, error occurred on this particular file, and then this is a custom message. So this is the service URL and what kind of method and request body. So if you are passing the create feedback, for example, you should be able to see create feedback request object details. If there is an authorization passed, you will be able to see that those kind of details. So this kind of custom exception is going to be useful in the environment for debugging the information. So that's how you will be configuring the middleware and the API for the custom exceptions which are going to be used in the environment itself. Before proceeding the next step, a quick recap. What we have done, created a new folder called middleware in the API and added the middleware component, and then called the middleware component from the starter. So this is not required. So it's going to be only in the actual environment. So locally we will be using the use developer exceptions, and then we also need a couple of classes to, and you can expand these features by using these classes. And for testing, we added the custom exception, so we don't need that. Let's comment that, and also added the exceptions folder with these files. So let me add some comments and commit and then proceed for the next step. Added middleware. Perfect. So let me, once this is pushed, I hope this is still working. Quickly make sure it's launching the Swagger and still working. So I'm going to now talk about the API versioning along with the Swagger. So that's the difficult part whenever you are working on API versioning. Without Swagger, it's going to be quicker. But with the Swagger, you have to make sure that doing things correctly. Otherwise, you end up spending a lot of time. So just like you see V1 here, we are going to have V1 and V2 as part of the API versioning in the Swagger. So let me add a folder here. So I already added in the earlier added two folders, V1 and V2, and V1 has my controller. So I'm going to copy the controller folder in the V2 also, and then this is something I will be calling as V1 controller, and this should be called as V2 controllers. The namespace, I just corrected it. And then we need to, if I am versioning the same controller in V2, then I have to make few adjustments in the API so that that API still works. So I have to make the API URL dynamic. So let me add this information under V1. So the route is corrected with the service name. So let me see, service name is feedback service, and then API versioning. So this is required for the Swagger. There is a namespace. So there is a NuGet package called Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC versioning. So this is what required. Find and install the latest version. Let me install that. Now that got installed. The same thing I need to correct in the version 2. So this will be called API versioning 2. So that's the change I need at the controller level. Now let me see what else is required. So the next, the bigger change for API versioning to make it along with the Swagger configuration. These are all hard-coded, so we have to make sure that we have to replace this. There are a lot of articles, but there is no perfect way to doing it. So you have to kind of spend a little bit more time to make sure that it is working along with the Swagger. As I mentioned, without Swagger, configuring the API versioning is easy, but along with the Swagger, we need some tweaks. So let me start copying some of the code I have already written here. This is the step one, add API versioning explorer. So let me see what using statement is missing. Okay, let me first copy and then come back to the using statements. So this is the second piece of information, add versioning API Explorer, add API versioning. So these are some of the configurations, for example, defaulting to version 1 in case the versioning is not specified. So, and also we need to correct the Swagger gen. This is the Swagger gen. So we need another install API versioning model. There is a private method. Correct this method and create a separate method here. So there is one more NuGet package missing here. Let me add that NuGet package. Okay, so this is the configuration required for versioning. So as I mentioned, this is the add version API Explorer to support the API. This is the versioning. Again, this is the add Swagger gen and supporting the enable annotations. Configuration, reading the description, attaching, and this is the title, version description, service description. So basically it is looping for each API version and then appending, adding the configuring the Swagger points. I can run, there are some build errors. So I need to add few things here in the startup. And number one, I need to add the API Explorer version description provider. This will be part of the API Explorer. I need to pass this provider. And also, if there are any errors here. Yep. So this is the error I'm expecting because we have not mentioned the launcher, what to start in the startup project. So I spent a little time to understand what went wrong. So the issue is we need to make sure that in the debug while running. So we have to append the service name here. It's going to be feedback service. So launch browser, make sure that you select this, if this works. Yep. So now I can see V1 and V2. So both have the same endpoint and along with the description. I run, I should be able to get the V1 working. And let me see if the V2 is also working as a. Yes. So as I mentioned, it's not very easy because you need this piece of code to configure the versioning along with the Swagger. And especially if you are running issues, make sure that you check this launch browser and then Swagger feedback. So this is going to update your properties launch settings. So the API should be working with the API versioning along with the Swagger. Before wrapping this session, let me quickly walk through what is covered. And also, I see use HS. Yes, so there are good articles and the best practices when to use, when not to use those things, and the MSDN articles. So this is basically used for the security purpose. So when you are especially using any kind of a proxies, it is going to be useful to force the URLs HTTPS. And then same thing, we have the HTTPS redirects, use routing authorization. So these are all the points I'm going to expand my session and continue making another video on improvements on the API side. So in this session, overall, what we discussed, so I can quickly look at the history of the changes I have done. Today, I added the Automapper dependency injection and moved the Swagger related code into separate file, added the service description, and then added the nlogs, and also added the middleware component. So that's my agenda for today. So I think pretty much covered. In the next one, I'll be focusing on the security related items like CORS and Azure Key Vault configuration. So that will be fun part, and also configuring the health check for the APIs. And then I'll start adding more endpoints for the CRUD operations and best practices on the CRUD operations. Also look for the entity framework core, configure the entity framework core, and actually storing the data in the database, reading the data from the database. So that will be my chapter number 4. So far, thank you for watching this video.